Welcome to the Parenting with Impact podcast with your hosts Elaine, Taylor-Klaus, and Diane, Dempster, co-creators of ImpactParents.com, an online community, award-winning blog, and service organization helping parents all over the world to raise complex kids become capable, independent adults.
Hi everyone, Elaine and Diane here, and we know that you want your complex kids to grow up to be happy and independent, and yet you're not always sure how or when to help with that.
In this podcast, we'll encourage you to collaborate with all kinds of complex kids and support them in navigating life and learning.
And we'll interview leading experts from around the world, as well as parents in our own community, talking about how training for parents actually helps these complex kids.
We'll talk about the issues we hear parents struggling with all the time and how a coach approach can support and empower your amazing young people.
We won't tell you what to do. We're going to help you figure out how. So let's move on to the next conversation. Welcome back, everybody, to another conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. My guest today is a brain specialist. This is Dr. Robert Melillo. He has a long and, I want to say storied, extraordinarily global successful career in bringing brain understanding and awareness and treatment to people like us who need it. So, Robert, thank you for being here. We agreed I'm going to call him Robert, not Dr. Melillo, because at some point I'll say it wrong. My dyslexia will kick in.
Yeah, it's an L of a name, right? Yes.
It is indeed. Welcome. It is great to have you here. Thank you for making the time to share your wonderful expertise with our community. Let's start by letting you kind of, as my coach would say, speak yourself into the room. Tell us, you've had a long career, so I don't want you to go through your whole bio, but what got you to be doing work with families or people of what we call complex human beings? What got you into this work?
Yeah, I've been a clinician for, the better part of 35 years. And from the very beginning, I was very interested. I got into healthcare as an athlete, and I wanted to kind of go into kind of a sports medicine rehab type thing. But then when I was in graduate school, I fell in love with neurology and the brain, and I became fascinated with it. And I've always been into also, things like diet and nutrition and exercise and all of that. And I wanted to kind of find a way that I could combine that together. So, early on, I received a diplomate and subspecialty in neurology and then rehabilitation. And then later on, I got another degree in clinical rehabilitation neuropsychology, and I have a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. And that's been my career of constantly educating in academics. But I had a very active practice, mostly working with adults and some adolescents. But then my own son was labeled with ADHD, and I had other families around me asking me about some of their kids. This was in the early 90s. And I was really starting to get into brain research. I was teaching on a graduate and postgraduate level, clinical neurology and rehab at that point. And so I really wanted to understand what was happening in my child's brain. And, someone gives you a label, and I wanted to know, okay, and I knew a lot about the brain at the time, but I didn't know what ADHD was. And so I went to people that I hoped would know, pediatricians, pediatric neurologists, neuropsychologists, psychiatrists, people that I knew, people that were colleagues, people that were friends. And I said the same thing. What's happening in the brain in ADHD? And they all looked at me like, don't really know. Maybe something with dopamine and the frontal lobe, but really don't know what it is. But there's not really anything you can do about it anyway. And I said, okay. You just told me you don't know what it is, but you're really absolutely sure you can't do anything.
Do anything about it, right?
At that point, I kind of dove into the research with a father's passion and a professional curiosity and a background. And it became kind of an obsession to answer this question. And it made its way into all of these different issues in the spectrum, all neurobehavioral disorders, autism, dyslexia, learning disabilities, OCD, tics, Tourette's. And that made its way into my first textbook, which is called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood and Evolutionary Perspective. But because I was a clinician and I wanted to help my own son and some other kids, I started working with people and experimenting with things. And as I started getting a better realization of what I believed the problem was, I wanted to see what I could do about it. And I started getting really great results early on. And that's just fueled me. And it's been basically, 30, 35 years of research and writing and academics and 8 best-selling books and, many, many different patients later. And I'm still looking to perfect it.
Right. Because it's an ongoing process. Maybe that's your neuroplasticity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's part of my journey. It's part of my learning to get better as a person, to get better, to help parents and help other people really just understand, raise awareness, and become the best version of themselves and their child.
Yeah, totally understand. And there's so many different directions I could go with this. I'm fascinated by the background of exercise and sports. My daughter is in med school at the moment and is in her neurology track. And I got a text just this morning that says, the first big takeaway from, and she was doing a dementia focus, was protect the brain with exercise.
Absolutely. So the thing about, like in my book, neurobehavioral disorders from an evolutionary perspective, is because from the very beginning, I went back and said, I wanted to know what were the origins of behavior, right? Like, where does behavior come from? What does it look like in the brain? What does thinking look like, a thought? And then even a more basic thing is, where do brains come from? And it turns out that the reason why a living thing developed a brain, the first thing to develop a brain, was because it was the first creature that moved. Movement creates the need for brains. Living things that don't move don't have brains. So movement is what created brains from an evolutionary standpoint, and it's also what creates our brains in childhood. And so anything that deviates from normal movement, and it will alter brain development and lead to different developmental imbalances, and that's superimposed on genetic traits. And that's where basically, all of the whole spectrum of neurobehavioral disorders and mental health issues in adults and children really start.
Wow. And that is the first time in all the years I've been doing this that I've ever heard anybody equate what the movement of childhood with the development of the brain.
Yeah, it's huge. It's really hugely important. And an area of my work is what we look at, I'm the world expert right now in something called retained primitive reflexes. The idea, I think, as we were parents and our kids growing up, we were taught to pay attention to the milestones, right? Like that they mattered. When they rolled over, did they crawl on their belly, did they crawl on all fours, when did they stand up, when did they walk, when did they speak, did they point, did they look, did they have good eye contact? All of those things are very, very important and really are critical to the development of the brain. We live in a world now, since post-COVID, that we're told that those things aren't important really anymore, and that parents are told that crawling isn't even a milestone anymore. And that is kind of crazy, but that's what people are being told now. But the idea of looking at these milestones and what they mean and why they're there, a lot of it has to do with these certain reflexes that we're born with to movement that allow the baby to initially move and engage and feed themselves and do these things. And those steps and those stages, we've proven, are very critical. And in many kids that we work with and adults, with those reflexes don't go away when they're supposed to at around 1, they can hold back brain development and lead to imbalances and accentuate strengths and weaknesses. And that leads to the presentation of symptoms that not only affect cognitive and behavior, but all affect the balance of the autonomic and the immune system, and all of these different issues that are really in the periphery of any kid with a neurobehavioral issue.
Interesting. So again, I'm shocked to hear you say that there is a shift since COVID in milestones. Like, I remember very vividly a physician saying to me, your kid needs to crawl because that develops neck muscles, just that simple, right? So I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I think a lot of us are probably going, what do you mean they've changed developmental milestones? Can you speak to that just a little bit?
The CDC came out with new milestones right up towards the tail end of COVID that basically extended everything and basically took out crawling as a milestone, and basically said that, even speaking at like 30 months is not speaking till like later is okay. And, more and more parents are told that it doesn't really matter if your child doesn't crawl or if they crawl in an unusual way. And a lot of it is really because, we've been seeing an epidemic rise, literal epidemic rise of neurobehavioral disorders in children over the past 3 decades. And with that, we see that there's been this impact on milestones. And so now, but literally there are people out there that say, well, 50% of children no longer crawl in a typical way. So
therefore,
no longer normal, right? And, that's the typical kind of left brain thinking of analyzing it. And it makes no common sense whatsoever, but that is kind of where we are, where we're kind of normalizing pathology right now.
And it's an interesting, I get asked this question all the time, and I'm sure you do probably more than I do, about is this rising awareness, rising diagnosis of autism, ADHD, anxiety, all of this stuff, is this a response to the world we're in? Is there more of it? Are we just seeing it more now? Like, actually, I'm going to ask you to contemplate that. We're going to take a quick break and come back, and I want to hear your thoughts about that. Hi, it's Elaine. And if you like this podcast, you'll love our coach approach. Whether you're a parent looking for support or a professional supporting families, we invite you to download a free guide with 12 key coaching tools at impactparents.com/gift. You can begin using a coach approach to help kids become more independent or improve all of your conversations at work and at home. That's impactparents.com/gift. Welcome back, everybody. My guest is Dr. Robert Melillo, and we're talking about brain development and designation of milestones. And you just mentioned that there's been this epidemic rise of neurobehavioral disorders over the last few decades. What's your understanding of that? What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, so my third book, I really researched this in great detail and published that several years ago on, what is actually driving these changes. And it's a combination. I mean, there is definitely some raised awareness and better diagnosis and some of that. But really, even according to some of the top experts in epidemiology, that only accounts for about 50% of the rise, right? The other 50% at least is really that there is unexplained, meaning that there is an actual increase in the numbers. And what I have done is really spoken to people on the ground. If you speak to anybody in the education world that's been in education for the last 30 years, they'll tell you that there's absolutely a dramatic increase in the amount of kids that have a diagnosis. And actually, the top epidemiologists will tell you that they actually believe that most of these issues are still underdiagnosed.
Agreed.
And many teachers will tell you that they're being told, don't give this kid a diagnosis, or don't label them, or the parents don't want their kids to get a label. And, schools are overwhelmed.
Well, I was going to say, and now schools, the whole way of designating it was shifted so that schools could evaluate for eligibility for services instead of for diagnosing the underlying issue that was going on, because the schools were and continue to be inundated and overwhelmed. When my kids were little, and my eldest is now 30, we had a lot of we did a lot of work in the nutritional realm before I got into coaching even. And one of the things I learned, and I know that this is anecdotal, but one of the things I learned is that when food dyes and food additives and flavors were added to our food supply, it was before the FDA was testing things like that. So there's a lot of stuff in our food supply that was never put through FDA processes.
The vast majority of chemicals that are used in industry have never been studied. A lot of them were just grandfathered in once they really adopted, the idea of looking at the FDA and looking at it. So most of them have never been tested, actually. And so, so that's an issue. But that's part of it. Obviously, that definitely plays a role. Estrogen disruptors, hormone disruptors, plastic, phthalates, pesticides, all of those things play a role really in both the mom and the dad, and play a role in that it leads to what we call epigenetic changes in the expression of genes. So it doesn't cause gene mutations. One of the things is that, in the vast majority of any sort of, neurobehavioral or mental health issue, there are no gene mutations. There are no actual mutations of genes. There's certainly no single mutations, but there are genes that are impacted where they're not being expressed at the level that they should. And these are environmental factors. And these factors are the factors that are coming together pre-conception and in the womb, in both men and women, by the way. And all of these are causing this actual increase, as well as a society. We're shifted dramatically. And one of the biggest shifts is the fact that what your daughter is saying about protecting the brain is that we don't move anywhere near the way we used to that previous generations moved. We are the most sedentary population in history. We're getting more sedentary all the time, and that's affecting earlier and earlier and earlier childhood. And so we see things like a rise in childhood obesity and diabetes. And, when I went to school, I was told that you will never see late onset diabetes in anyone under 60, that it's only for old people. Now you see the kids that are under 10 routinely. And that's being driven mainly by, again, technology, lack of movement, parents being afraid to let their children outside, more awareness. So there's a lot of things driving that, but it's environmental factors that are driving, and mostly lifestyle factors.
And I think what I heard underneath that is that you've got the lifestyle factors of movement. You've got what's happened, the different kinds of chemicals that have been brought into the food and world supply since the 1950s, we would say, although some might argue since the Industrial Revolution. Is there anything else that you feel like is contributing to this?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of my work really revolves around understanding the development of the right and left brain and the interactions of that. Basically, any sort of neurobehavioral or mental health issue is a disruption of that normal connectivity between the right and left hemisphere and a normal type of developmental imbalance in how we do it. So that overactive areas on one side combined with underdevelopment, and all of it is based on maturational alteration of maturity. This is where all of our research, there's no damage, there's no injury, there's no pathology, there's no metabolic disease per se. There are chemicals and other factors that can affect the expression of genes, but the majority of it is affecting the way that networks are growing and developing and communicating, what we call functional connectivity. This is what everything is revolved around. And a lot of that has to do with we're moving more and more towards a left brain dominant type of society in a world. And what we see, the right brain is really the main part of the human brain. The subconscious, the unconscious part of our brain is really what regulates our emotions and social development and emotional regulation and connection to our body. And that is being impacted dramatically more and more, where it's not developing, it's not being developed as appropriately, or it's being overdeveloped. And this is, I believe, that all the symptoms can be explained by.
So you're almost describing a hampered maturation process in a way. That's kind of what I'm hearing. Is that accurate?
Say that again. What kind of maturation process?
Like a dampened maturation process.
That is exactly what's happening. What's happening is that there is a developmental delay and imbalance where we see that some areas of the brain come online too early. Like with traditional ADHD, we see that, and autism spectrum, we see that virtually, and these are built on traits, right? So virtually anybody in the autism spectrum I've ever worked with that, that don't have what we call syndromic autism, which is different, but has no genetic mutation or anything like that. They are geniuses with their left brain. Their left brains are incredibly powerful and really good. Most of my work is with non-speaking autism. So that looking at these kids that are really impaired in their ability to communicate. But when you have ways that they can communicate, like using letterboards or things like that, I had an 8-year-old from New Zealand who has never spoken And when he started to be able to type with assistance on his mother's phone, and the first thing he wanted to type about was quantum physics. He knew everything about quantum mechanics, and he was defining physics term. He's brilliant, geniuses, right? It's all there. All the language is there, but they're so disconnected from their body and their feelings of their body and being able to control their body. And that is what really impacts their ability to speak. And they may not have the drive to have the same level of attachment or social interaction because of that lack of immaturity. So it's all of these immaturity imbalances and deficits that are really at the root cause. And we know basically, I mean, that all adult mental health issues start in childhood. So those first 6 years are really the critical period of the development of the right and left brain and how they connect. If that's altered in any way, then that's superimposed on people that have very strong natural strengths or weaknesses. And then that can lead to these imbalances, which ultimately lead to these, whatever we label it as.
Okay. So what do you think is important for parents of what I call complex kids to understand based on your work and your research? What do they need to know most of all?
Yeah, I think most of all, you need to really understand it in neurological terms, that when you look at the neuroanatomy of the brain, the way the brain literally grows and the connections. And so when we're looking at complex kids that may have, different things, whether you're dealing with children that may or may not have had more, emotional dysregulation or very emotionally reactive, maybe struggled in school, might have been dyslexic or had learning disabilities or learning challenges. The idea that there's this unevenness of skills in these kids, right? That's one of the first things I came across in the early 90s. The research was pointing to anybody on any sort of attentional behavioral spectrum, that they weren't really delayed in everything. In fact, they were often gifted.
Exactly, yeah.
Of twice exceptional. That represents this developmental imbalance. And the kids that are most gifted are the ones that are more vulnerable to some sort of imbalance or deficit on the other side of the brain. And these imbalances are the root cause of any of the issues or challenges that they have. And that can be changed. So, again, the understanding that there is a neurobiological reason. And most parents, that's the first question. I get people that come from all over the world that have been everywhere. And first question I say to them is, has anybody tried to explain to you what's happening in your child's brain or in your brain? And they look at me, and every single one of them, they say, no one.
Yeah,
we
encounter a similar circumstance.
Yeah. So for me, I try to define it, and I've actually written, papers on this, and I think I understand the brain about as well as anybody in the world from a functional perspective. Like, for instance, somebody has OCD behaviors. So obsessive thoughts come from overactivity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left, usually with a deficit of that on the right. That area is also responsible for what we call reality testing. So if there's a deficit on the right, people might also experience a loss of touch with the reality. So compulsive behavior comes from overactivity of the orbital frontal cortex, Brodmann area 11 and 12. So there's specific areas of the brain. Stimming, tics, comes from an overactivity in the left of an area called Brodmann area 6 because of underdevelopment of that in the right. Depression, we look at depression and anxiety. The left hemisphere and the frontal lobe generates joy and happiness and anger. And the right hemisphere generates fear, sadness, guilt, shame, embarrassment, attachment, and empathy. So if you have decreased joy, increased sadness mixed with guilt and shame, that's the definition of major depressive disorder, right? Wow. So there are neurological areas of the brain that explain everything, even the regulation of the immune system and the digestive system. So all of that is how I look at it. And then we can do things to stimulate certain areas, inhibit other areas, and try to create more balance in a measurable, objective way. And that is something that we can do to help people optimize behavior and become the best version of themselves and lower things like their anxiety or depression, or make them more happy, or lower their anger, or improve their attention, or all of those things.
Yeah. Well, what strikes me is, we need to begin to wrap this conversation, but what strikes me for those of us in our world and those of us listening, the takeaway for me is how important it is to understand what's underlying the behavior. And you can look at it from it's this part of the brain or that part of the brain. I'm going to look at it and say it's in the brain,
Right.
and we need to understand that's the case and meet that where it is, rather than judging that behavior or making assumptions about that behavior. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, again, I have a 27-year-old who was reading last night for the first time the psychoeducational evaluation that was done for her 20 years ago. And it was fascinating to watch her process and go through, now from a physician's lens, a medical student's lens, going through the detail of that evaluation and identifying for herself where one area was kind of off the charts and the other area was in 16th percentile. And no wonder I was struggling, Mom.
Right.
Right. And
The
to see
idea,
that
though,
disparity was super helpful.
Right. So the question is, why was that there? And it's
Right.
because she's unusually gifted in that one area, but because there was something that may have altered the early development of the other side, or one side came online too early, it interfered with that. And that balance, that gap, is the actual issue. And the more
Right.
that gap is, and it's not, there's nothing, again, wrong with the brain. If anything, it's that areas are too good, but other areas may not keep up. But the most important thing is that you can change that gap. And
Well-
that actually,
Well, and I also want to say the other really important thing to the parents listening is, this is not a woulda, coulda, shoulda moment to beat yourself up for whatever crawling didn't happen when your kid was 2 years old. That is not what this is about. Because I know that there are a lot of us who go to, oh my God, what did I do? And I'm hearing you saying this isn't about what any individual did. This is just how this brain developed in the context of the world we're in.
right.
And we need to be aware that's part of what's happening. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
that's right. It's definitely not about anybody feeling guilt or shame or blame or anything. It's about trying to understand, the brain of your child or yourself, and understand, what's going on. And again, it all starts with, if your child has any sort of an imbalance, it's because they're actually gifted in the area. That's something that I know for sure. So
Yeah.
it's not something about feeling bad. It's about realizing that you gave them an incredible gift. But what happens is, people that are very gifted also have more vulnerabilities and are more susceptible to possibly developing an imbalance. And the good news is that can be changed at any age. So there's no, not about going back and feeling like, oh, did I miss something? No, it's about understanding it now and saying, okay, what can we do moving forward? And is there a way to help and understand it better? And and that's what my work's all about.
I love it. Well, great segue. Why don't you tell people how they can find out more about you?
My website, drrobertmelillo.com, there's a lot of information on there. And I have professional courses where, I've trained physicians and therapists all over the world and continue to do so. We have an online fellowship course. I also, have a lot of best-selling books out there. Disconnected Kids. We just had the third edition. It's from Penguin, and the third edition just came out about 3 weeks ago. And that book is one of the, biggest selling books in that genre. It's translated into 18 languages and obviously still continues to be relevant, hence the third edition. And I'm very active on Instagram, social media.
Great. Love that. We'll have all of that in the show notes. And my commitment to everybody is that I'll follow up and get a couple of key book links to have in the show notes for everybody to be able to access. Thank you for that. So before we wrap the conversation, is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to make sure we hit, or is there something you did talk about that you want to kind of highlight and bring attention to before we wrap?
So I think, there's so much, but the idea that the brain regulates anything, so everything. So what we see is that when there are these imbalances, they can cause things like food sensitivities and eczema and overactivity of the immune system and dysregulation of the gut. And so most of those biomedical issues the idea that, many people are told that many problems start in the gut. It really doesn't. It starts in the brain, but that it does impact the gut, and that all of those things are interrelated, and it's all really part of one, issue, which has to do with mostly brain development and function. And that's really the gist of it.
Thank you. It's a lot to take in, and an important conversation for all of us to think about. In our world, we're coaches and we teach parents coaching skills that are neurodiversity informed. So for us, the very most simplistic thing that we teach all the time that reinforces what you're saying is it all starts in the brain.
Absolutely.
And everybody, it starts in the brain. Whatever's going on, whatever behavior, what challenge, whatever you're dealing with, the brain is a fundamental piece. And the more you can understand that, learn to regulate it, manage it, chill it out, support it, give it nutrition, exercise it, give it sleep, the better things are going to be for you and for your kids. Is that fair?
Yes, but where I would take that one step is that it's also about being directed in what you do, right? It's not just about overall, all of that is good, but if you want to change the brain in a positive way, being as directed as possible and having an informed understanding of that, I think is really important as well.
Beautiful. Awesome. So before we close, we always like to ask a little fun fact. Do you have a favorite quote or motto that you want to share with our community?
I do. I don't know if I'll remember the whole quote, but it's by Teddy Roosevelt. And it basically goes that it's not the critic who counts. It's the person who's in the arena, whose face is marred with blood and sweat, who tries again and again and fails. But, if he does fail, at least he knows while daring greatly. The point is that I've always kind of, tried to go out there and do things. And, anytime you're trying to do anything significant, you're always going to come up with criticism in this day and age more than ever. And you can't listen to the critics. It's about going out there, doing your best. And even if you fail, you failed while trying greatly. That's my main motto.
Yeah. In the coaching world, we call it failing forward. So I love that. Failing by trying greatly. Beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here, for joining us, for what you're doing in the world. Everybody, my guest has been Dr. Robert Melillo. His information is in the show notes. I encourage you to check it out and find out more. There's nothing more powerful than getting a better understanding of what's going on in your brain or what's going on in your child's brain. And so for those of you listening, take a moment and ask yourself, what's your insight from this conversation? What are you taking away from this conversation? And how do you want to apply it in your life in the coming week? I know what we were talking about, but what did you take from it, and how do you want to use it? It's that insight and application that really helps you take this information and make it actionable in your life. So what are you taking away, and how do you want to apply it? And as always, thanks for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. At the end of the day, you make an extraordinary difference. See you on the next one, y'all.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For the essentials of Elaine and Diane's coach approach to parenting, download a free tip sheet at impactparents.com/podcast.
Behavior therapy training for parents is actually recommended as a first-line treatment for complex kids. For information about Sanity School, our training program for parents or teachers, which has helped thousands of families around the globe, visit impactparents.com/Sanity School.